This is Brett Hayworth, and welcome to What's a Frequency, our half-hour show on Siouxland Public Media. With this show, we give you a variety of important information on key issues that impact our lives. This frequency episode is devoted to the big 2024 general election results that have become known this week after Americans voted. Republican Donald Trump won the state of Iowa in his 6 electoral votes Tuesday evening for the third time. He also won handily in South Dakota and took 4 of the 5 electoral votes in Nebraska. Trump then won the presidency on Wednesday once some swing state outcomes like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Michigan became known. There were not only federal contests, such as the presidency and congressional posts to settle, but there were also some state legislative races and even some special ballot measures, as was the case in Nebraska and South Dakota, where abortion and other issues were on the ballot. The guests for this episode to discuss a host of takeaways from the election include 3 political science professors from Siouxland colleges, including Julia Helwig from the University of South Dakota, Bradley Best of Buena Vista University, and Patrick McKinley of Morningside University. I will add that this same group of 3 political scientists gathered about 2 months ago. We sought to preview the election at that point, and now we may revisit some of the comments that you guys made. So thank you all for joining me.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
I want to start with the presidential race. Did the 3 of you have an impression on who you thought would win between former President Trump and Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris?
I don't think most political scientists like to make predictions. I think there's a small subset of political scientists who do make it their business, and sometimes really their business, to do predictions in presidential elections. But the vast majority of political science professors, we really analyze what are the factors that could contribute and what are the implications of the various choices, and don't really do a lot of prediction studies. But I do think that we were all very well aware, and I guess I'll just speak to myself, that we knew it would be very competitive. And I would say probably our main prediction that we were probably wrong on was that we expected it would probably take longer to get the answer. And so if there was any prediction, we thought it would be a delay in knowing what the votes would be like.
More like days than less than 24 hours.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I can say just another point about this, if there's anything that kind of drives political scientists crazy, it's the way in which our election seasons have become these horse races.
Yeah.
And, we encourage our students, we encourage the public, we encourage debate about policy issues and keeping a focus on the broad issues rather than who's up, who's down. And so getting caught into that is kind of problematic. And yes, everybody is looking at the polls, but we also recognize the polls are snapshots in time and that they have their own flaws. And so they can help folks have a sense of things, but we also realize that they're not going to give you a completely accurate picture of anything.
I mean, Professor Best.
I would agree with everything that's been said here. I do like to look somewhat closely at election forecasting models, yet in my own work as a political scientist, I'm very, very hesitant always to, as my colleagues are, to make any sort of firm predictions about where I think particularly a presidential race is going. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge that at about 30 days out, I did anticipate a narrow win for Harris. I had it wrong, and for a handful of reasons. I thought that the what we might refer to as the political fundamentals were there, and we talked about that a bit in our last discussion. I thought that a handful of the key fundamentals were really there and working in Harris's favor, and we're going to push her in the direction of and push the electorate in the direction of a narrow victory for Harris. Narrow both in terms of the popular vote and probably also a narrow vote in the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. I did see, in my own sort of attempt to anticipate this, I did anticipate that she would do much better in the 7 battleground states, as we call them, the 7 swing states. Sure. And that would give her a narrow victory. But that was a very tentative guess at that time, based on some polling-based forecast, as well as some some non-polling based forecasts that were out there. Again, a tentative prediction, but one that I did make, at least in the presence of my students and in the presence of some of my colleagues. And I think I know where we were wrong, actually.
And can you just, that's Professor Bradley Best, the voice that you just heard there, what did you mean by fundamentals? Just give a flavor for what you mean by that.
Well, first of all, the conditions in the macroeconomy, quite apart from what we might refer to as pocketbook voters who are appraising their own personal financial and economic circumstance against perhaps where they were 4 years prior. Contrast that with some broader measures of the health of the macroeconomy. First of all, I thought that was probably working in the favor of the incumbent party, heading into 2024. I felt, in addition to that, I felt that there was a bit more wind at Harris's back via incumbency than being a member of the incumbent party than was perhaps there, and coming out of the convention, and in the weeks immediately prior to that, after Biden stepped aside, the momentum that Harris seemed to have moving into the final couple months of that campaign, it felt like there was a new momentum again and a new energy moving in her direction that I thought was going to make this more competitive than it turned out to be in the end. Trump did not win by a large margin in the popular vote, but we know that that's not how we determine the outcomes in presidential elections. So for that, and actually for some of the reasons that we can refer to, maybe perhaps in a model by a person like Alan Lichtman, okay, who's discussed so very, very much, the American University professor who is noted for his success in predicting election outcomes. I thought that Harris was coming into this with a bit of an edge, but it's been interesting to see how this all played out, and I've been trying to sort of assess my own kind of missteps in making those predictions.
Patrick McKinley.
Well, I mean,
yeah,
and it's very early, and I won't claim to have read even a fraction of the postmortems that have already been written, and they will continue to come out for a long time, both assessing how did President-elect Trump come up with his winning coalition, but also what sorts of things limited Harris's chances in this regard. And I just would like to speak to one of the ones that we've been seeing is that, there's a lot of folks who've been paying attention to the macroeconomics and saying, wow, these are good trends, but that may not have been how the voters were feeling about those trends. And I think that that's an important moment that a lot of folks are going to have to pay attention to is literally how is it felt on a day-to-day basis by the average American voter. And I think that's a good cue for those of us who obsess about what's happening in federal data releases and things like that we're kind of alone in how we see that. They see it when they go to the grocery store and when they go to the gas station.
Julia.
I think that's exactly right. I think the macroeconomics were there, but for the average American voter, that's a fairly high level, high information kind of issue. And what they're seeing is high prices at the store. How far does my dollar go? How far does my paycheck stretch, right? I just think the macroeconomics is much more complex than what you're seeing in your pocketbook. But that also relates to a different topic, which is that information piece. And we do know that we saw a lower turnout among higher educated voters. And so we say the average American voter, well, not all of them were turning out, right? And so if the ones who are lower information voters are more likely to turn out, then they're the ones who also are more likely to be appealed to by the pocketbook voting as opposed to the macroeconomics. Well, then that turnout interaction with the pocketbook voting also helps to explain some of that. So it's not just a vote choice in terms of individual preferences, it's the outcome that's explained by the turnout.
And this, and the voice you just heard there, that's University of South Dakota professor Julia Hellwig. We're on this edition of What's the Frequency. We're discussing the 2024 general election results. We also have Patrick McKinley. He's a professor with Morningside University, and I think Bradley Best Buena Vista University, you wanted to chime in there.
Well, I just want to follow up on something that both of my colleagues have said here. I think that many of us, myself included, I think we underestimated the way in which that economy that, as Julie correctly pointed out, that to us as social scientists, we're looking at this and we're seeing that there is this that there's this a little bit of a disconnect. There's this gap between the way in which sort of the typical voter is encountering and experiencing and assigning meaning to their own experiences in the economy versus the measures of the health of the macroeconomy that we are looking at. And I think to some extent we underestimated just how heavily those individual sort of reactions, experiences, and the meaning that they were assigning to the fact that groceries are more expensive, perhaps at least in their experience, and how that was really playing on the national mood, frankly, that I see as, again, kind of this catch-all category of factors and forces that I think accounted much more so for what we encountered Tuesday, what we saw Tuesday, than I think perhaps we anticipated.
And if I can pick up on something else you said earlier about the incumbency question, is that typically incumbency might have been an asset, but it appears quite clearly that President Biden's relative lack of popularity was weighing on her, and the question about to what extent should she separate from the current administration, to what extent is she responsible, etc. Those things played out. But let's put this into broader context. Also, that's going to be back to the macroeconomics. We know that, comparatively speaking, the rest of the world would love to have the economy we've got right now. That's just true. The American economy is performing reasonably well. The unemployment rate's at a very good level, comparatively speaking. But globally, the races, this has been a year of elections across the globe, and incumbents have been getting beaten over and over again. And so it's kind of not just in the United States, but globally, it's kind of a change year. And so I think that's going to get us to think about incumbency a little bit, making sure that we're thinking about it in terms, because a lot of those same pressures on inflation and pocketbook issues are not just being felt in the United States. They're profoundly global in scope.
And that's precisely because the voters are placing the blame on the government for not protecting them, the lack of consumer protections from, for example, greedflation, which leads to those increased prices. And so the voters see those prices being high, and so they then turn and say, why hasn't the government done anything about this? Prices were cheaper under the previous president who's now running again. Let's go back to that. And so I think that's exactly what happened, is that they placed that blame on the current governments. And so that incumbency advantage that could have, should have, would have been there because the macroeconomy is doing great, just doesn't end up playing out. I also should add that we're a little bit unfair now because now we're sort of responding to Brad's, prediction because we have the post hoc information. But I appreciate you, starting the conversation that way.
Well, I think one thing that I think a lot of us are learning about, what happened here, and certainly one of the tentative conclusions that I'm coming to is that we might have underappreciated. I think a lot of people underappreciated just how steep the climb really was for Kamala Harris, entering the race at such a late date at the top of the ticket, because we were a bit taken in by that swell of energy that sort of gravitated directly to her, particularly coming out of the convention, the nice convention bounce that she was getting. We were seeing some numbers moving in her direction. We didn't, I think in a lot of cases, adequately appreciate that she really was trying to do two things. She was trying to both harness the momentum that incumbency can provide, but in her case, she was trying to do it against the backdrop of a very, very unpopular Joe Biden with public approval ratings down around 40%. And she was doing so, and I would just add this a little bit, she was attempting to do so in a political space where her candidacy, her fitness for office, all of that was going to be weighed against what I would call conventional standards by which the electorate measures the desirability of a candidate. We had forgotten a bit that she was matched up against an opponent, a challenger in this case, Donald Trump, whose fitness for office, whose candidacy, everything that he does in terms of maneuvering us on the campaign trail are evaluated against an entirely different or perhaps even absent set of criteria. Okay, so we had two very different sets of appraisals at work in this in this campaign. One was applied to a candidate that had very little time to turn this thing around and then try to figure out again how to both represent the incumbent party but yet figure out how much to separate herself from a candidate in Joe Biden, or who was a candidate in Joe Biden, that really had a lot of trouble and a lot of baggage coming into the race.
Thank you. And the voice you heard here on this What's the Frequency special election recap episode was Professor Bradley Best with Buena Vista University. We also have Morningside University's Patrick McKinley and the University of South Dakota's political science Professor Julia Hellweg. Talked about people view the economics of what are happening in America. We have a piece from South Dakota Newswatch. They interviewed people from South Dakota who had diverse opinions on why they cast their vote. One woman from New Underwood, South Dakota, said her 25-year-old son cannot afford his apartment. A young carpenter said social activities were limited by the high cost of living. And a business owner said he absorbed cost increases rather than passing them on to customers, and all three of those people voted for Trump. So I just think that goes back to some of the things that you said about how people like the larger macroeconomics versus, I guess, pocketbook.
It appears that all politics is personal.
Yeah. And then I want to go to, and this is probably, I don't know if this is too low-minded of a question, of a way to phrase this, but was the Trump win more what Trump himself did, or maybe what, in some ways, that Harris failed or didn't quite reach voters the way that she wanted to?
Well, I think, Brad, you kind of set it up that everyone would agree that President-elect Trump is kind of a phenomenon unto himself, in terms of how he does things. He is the most unconventional sort of political actor that we've witnessed, and that's on this occasion been incredibly successful for him. People could look back at the Madison Square Garden event, and you had plenty of folks saying, "Well, that was an unmitigated disaster." It may not have mattered at all. Back to the question of was anybody other than the politics addicted class, of which I am a proud member, we were paying attention, but perhaps not everyday voters. They may have seen something about it quickly on 15 seconds on the evening news, but not put it into any particular context.
Patrick, I've wondered the very same thing.
And in the case of
how broad
Harris,
is that digested?
What did she do? There's going to be lots of discussions about what she should have done, coulda, woulda, shoulda. But it's she had a different hill to climb, and it appears that President Trump was seeking a very different, unique path unto himself. And so I think comparing them, I think they were, in a sense, playing in two very different games.
I also think that because they are, we have one, both of them are sort of pseudo-incumbent candidates, right? One was president in a previous administration, and one is the vice president in the current administration. And I think that's just a very different kind of context than if you had an open election. And so thinking about the campaign strategies there, I'm just not convinced that the campaign strategy was as important this time as it could have been if there were an open election. Because maybe those voters aren't paying as much attention because they feel like they already know these candidates. They already know it's the current administration versus the previous administration, and that's it. And so I do think that that allowed for all these other factors that we talked about, like the economy in the micro kind of sense, to have a greater effect than it otherwise maybe would have. Maybe in a different scenario, the candidate and campaign strategy kinds of factors would have mattered more.
I think to Julie's point, as we are, and we're just a few days out, but as a bit more data and as a bit more evidence is sort of emerging here, the thing that I'm increasingly impressed by is that I think we are watching, we are witnessing, we are seeing a very, very significant rightward shift ideologically in this country. And I think, again, to Julie's point, I'm not completely sure that the outcome would have been all that different, even in the absence of Donald Trump. That's a question that I'm asking myself. What if another Republican had been matched with Harris? What we're seeing now, I'm not certain that the electorate was prepared to go in a Democratic direction, or that the forces were there to accomplish that. With that in mind, the other sort of counterfactual, and I'm really curious about my colleagues' reaction to this one. The other counterfactual that I've been sort of toying with, a bit in my mind is, what would we be talking about today if, in fact, Harris had won? And I think the short answer to that is we would be saying that that the electorate had issued an open, clear, and rather loud repudiation of the Trump style, and that a lot of what we have seen going on in a lot of red states politically, Iowa as a case in point, that a pushback was occurring, that we were seeing perhaps not a blue wave, but some blue pushback on and across the country. The fact that we were not talking about that, the fact that that's not the course of the conversation, leads me to believe that the outcome that we're seeing here, in fact, reflects what the electorate wants. And the electorate, I think, back to my earlier comments, I think the electorate has chosen a personal style in our political life and in public spaces that we're going to have to think through, and we're going to have to figure out how that works in a democracy.
I think that counterfactual is really interesting. Like, what would have happened what would we be talking about if Harris had won? And I think that part of that is the democratic process, right? Like, we know that Donald Trump has repeatedly really acted in ways that are not democratic, and has professed and has proposed measures that are anti-democratic to what we understand democratic processes to work as political scientists. That is true. And so the question is it that these voters are in favor of that style? And I'm not sure I'm convinced of that. I think it's that when you're in that booth, you have only two options. And they were focusing on their own personal economic ability, right? Like their own pocketbooks. And so it's not just that, like, oh, we want this anti-democratic style. And, it's that, well, we're going to have to put up with that because, and for the most voters, I do think that there are some voters, certainly, and we certainly know this is true, that there are some that are strong Trump followers and appreciate and like this populist kind of style. I'm not discrediting that at all. But I do think for a lot of more moderate Republicans, it's more of a feeling that, well, we might have to put up with that unorthodox, anti-democratic style and populist style of leading if it means that we can have more money in our pocketbooks. And so I do think that was, a choice to make.
And and that voice you just heard was Julia Hillwig. She's a political science professor with the University of South Dakota. We also have Bradley Best of the Buena Vista University and Patrick McKinley from Morningside University as we dissect the 2024 election results. Trump has been impeached once. He's encouraged an insurrection after he lost 4 years ago, and he's the first convicted felon elected to the presidency. And what I wanted to pose, and I think you were getting there, Julia, was why do you think people who vote for him can overlook that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to be answering that question directly. I've got to think about that for a minute. But I think we've got a little bit of a potentially a debate here that is worthy of looking at. Does you've had folks say, well, is this a new realignment? And yet, and I've only had a little bit of time to look at exit polling, but it actually looked like at the end of the day, Harris's positives were higher than Trump's. So was this we're going to give this a go? Maybe I'm siding a bit with Julia on this a bit more, that on this occasion we're going to do this because I did better. I perceived that I was doing better under the previous administration's policies, and then we can see how that works out. Perhaps asking themselves, do all those other things matter when at the end of the day at the end of the day, people are worried about what does this mean for me and my family and what's happening in my community and so forth. And so if they're using that as their benchmark, then all of those other attributes about President Trump may not be as relevant to them. And what will be interesting is looking forward is how one governs and whether that has impacts. That's going to be obviously where we're going to be needing to think about going to next.
That was actually going to be my next question, Patrick.
There's a lot of promises out there that and some are very popular, but they could have dramatic macroeconomic ramifications. And so we can talk about tariffs. We can talk about if we do these tax cuts, we do those tax cuts, but that comes back to deficits, that comes back to other things. So, and those have other, ramifications with those policy choices that will impact everyday people. And so I'll be curious. I mean, you could endure that if you've got a new coalition because they can see that it's going to lead to a future you really want. But if it's based on these immediate pocketbook issues, that could be consequential.
And that was where I was going to take my next question. But did you have something else, Professor Best?
I think again, this is such an interesting discussion, and the part of the part of this puzzle that continues to work on my mind is the fact that Trump did measurably better with several demographic groups, with several population subsets, even when we look at this from in terms of geographic space. But back to the sort of the social group membership kind of piece of this, young men, young male voters. He also made up some pretty significant ground with Hispanic men, and so. Just two examples there of demographic groups where he seems to have gotten more traction this time around than Biden did, perhaps in 2020, and perhaps Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And if we add into that the fact that though the gender gap remains sizable, he continues to do, and Republicans are doing even a little better with white women, frankly, in the electorate. So when all of that is brought to bear on this, I'm left a little bit suspicious, I think, that there are some key demographic groups that, and I would use the example of Latino men and Latino women, that we just are not yet understanding well enough in terms of how they're interacting with our political system.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think about this all the time. So when I was a relatively new journalist, as a print journalist here in Sioux City, I remember in the 2004 election, I remember writing a big analysis story, talked to political scientists, talked to activists, et cetera. Where will Latino vote land? Will it go to Democratic or Republican? And it's been 20 years since then, and it still is up in the air, so to speak.
Well, as a Latina myself, who works a lot in the Latino caucus of the American Political Science Association, I will say that some of the recent research on Latino politics has really shown that while, yes, those social demographics are important and immigration question is, a very, very salient one, obviously, among Latinos, we do need to think about sub-demographics among Hispanics, both gender, as well as country of origin, as well as the length of time that people have been here. I'm a first generation, I'm an immigrant myself, whereas other folks, have been here now for many generations. As you said, this has been a question for decades now, and those folks there's a difference between the people who are new immigrants and people who are undocumented immigrants and people who have been here for a long time, not to mention the previous state I lived in New Mexico, where you have Hispanic voters who have been here for a very long time. But there is some more recent research, and I'm going to think about Derek Wakefield in particular, who has done some work on showing how important economics are to Latinos in particular, as well as my own research on political participation during the recession that show that Latinos are particularly susceptible to economic conditions. And so while white voters are somewhat protected because they have a higher level of average income, and Black Americans are more likely to have that group consciousness that brings them together, that social demographics, Latino voters are actually the ones who are the most responsive to our traditional resource models of voting and vote choice, precisely because they are much more likely to be affected by economic conditions in ways that African Americans with lower levels and Native Americans, again, with lower levels of economic conditions, and white Americans sort of being protected from that.
If I can just nerd out for one
yes,
moment.
And this is the voice you're about to hear is Patrick McKinley from Morningside University. Go ahead.
But I was thinking about that as you raised that question, because it immediately came to my mind. You cite the research much more eloquently than I. However, I've been kind of curious if literally one could look at those sub-demographics in terms of home ownership, because again, in this context, many Americans, which frankly is white Americans in particular, have seen their net wealth increase dramatically because the cost of housing has gone up so dramatically. But for folks who are either newer to new mortgage or seeking new mortgages for the first time, who don't have even the simplest forms of generational wealth, but especially for those who maybe are living in communities and contexts where renting is more predominant, those impacts are going to be more significant.
I think we just anticipated, I know that I did, that promises, if not threats, from Donald Trump that he would initiate on day one a massive deportation campaign, that I just anticipated that was going to resonate so badly, universally, in a bad way, with the Latino population, that sort of the negative affect that was going to generate was going to cross economic boundaries. Okay, that was going to obliterate the effect of concerns about how am I doing in the economy.
I do still think that's true, and I think there are a lot of Latino Americans today who are very worried and who are very concerned. I know I have friends in California whose students are scared that they and their families are going to be deported. And I do think that is true. That said, there is not the same levels of group consciousness among the Latino population as there is among African Americans. And so the sense that what happens to you could happen to me just doesn't quite exist in the same extent. It exists among Latinos, just not to the same great levels. And so I do also know that there are some feelings among some Latino members that, well, I made it, so why can't you? And the immigration question is really challenging to understand among the Latino population, because there are those who have sort of made it, and how quickly and easily we forget how difficult that process was, especially through generations. And so I think the Latino vote continues to be volatile and continues to be a space where we need to think more deeply about it.
For this edition of What's the Frequency, we're discussing the November 2024 general election results nationally and in Siouxland. And we have three political science professors from Siouxland. The voice you just heard was Julia Helwig from the University of South Dakota. We have Bradley Best from Buena Vista University in Storm Lake, and Patrick McKinley from Morningside University in Sioux City. What you've been talking about is where I wanted to go next. What will a Trump second presidency look like? He seems slow in getting going in 2017 in terms of presiding over government. He had the goal of obliterating Obamacare. That didn't happen. It wasn't well focused, I guess, in getting things off. Do you think he's more set to do? What do you think he will do? And is he set to do it more quickly with the well-recounted Project 2025?
Well, I think we can start off with the immigration thing since we were just talking about that,
Yeah.
because I think this is going to be particularly challenging for Donald Trump because on the one hand, mass deportations and wanting to push out these immigrants. But if we look at where some more economic boosts are, it's precisely because low-income immigration, in part here in Iowa as well, where a lot of factories rely on that relatively cheaper labor, that has come from particularly Mexican, El Salvadoran, Central American immigration. And I think that's going to be very challenging. I think he's going to have a hard time with these businesses who have supported him and who are expecting lower regulations from a Republican administration, but who also rely on that cheaper labor in order to make those profits. And so I think that's going to be a challenging conversation where Donald Trump is going to have to work closely with his advisors in order to make this work well for the businesses that have supported him.
I think another area I'd throw into that ties into the last topic we were discussing is when you look at the demand that is nationwide, that we need more housing and that more affordable housing, and where you look for that labor tends to come predominantly from in that immigrant community to provide that labor. We how many days go by that you hear, well, we don't have enough people in the trades. We don't have enough people in the trades. Well, if you're starting to lose that, or even if you've just elevated the potential risk and people stay away from those areas for fear of their immigration status being brought to light, then that's going to have other consequences for housing costs that may be unintentional but impactful nonetheless. I do think I think we'd all agree though that this a second Trump administration would have has many connections throughout the conservative policy community. There's lots of discussions about Project 2025 and other sorts of things. There are a lot of folks out there who've shown their loyalty to President Trump and are eager to serve in a second administration. The likelihood is that they have a little bit better sense of the sorts of folks that they want in those positions and where those positions can make their impacts felt most immediately. So I think that we can kind of anticipate them. And if they have, it appears that they have the Senate, so confirmation will be eased in that context. And so being able to place people relatively quickly, I think it's something that people should expect.
Any other thoughts on what sort of policies Trump will establish or pursue?
Not necessarily about policies, but you do raise an interesting question, or it's sort of embedded in there is what his new branch will look like. Who are the people who are going to fill these appointed positions? I'd be very curious to see if we have any folks who are coming back to those positions, or who are the ones who are going to be appointed into these both agencies and the various departments of our executive branch. I think that's the next question probably is.
There was a lot of belief last time that I guess same old's like a traditional come up from policy type person who maybe had experience in departments, didn't want to be part of Trump administration one, but now that the guardrails would be there, and that those sort of people would be more willing to serve in the second administration. Sorry, go ahead, Professor Best.
Since I've done such a terrific job in recent months at making predictions, I'm gonna go ahead and stick my neck out here a little bit of this, but
It's a nice chuckle that went through the room here.
I'm going to I'm going to go a bit out on a limb here and say that if we take Donald Trump at his word, I think that one thing that we're absolutely going to see is someone testing the limits consistently and continuously throughout the next 4 years, and that is the limits of executive power. He's made that entirely clear. The Supreme Court has really paved the way for this with the widely examined, much examined decision this summer that essentially indicates that presidents are immune for any actions taken, even immune from criminal prosecution for actions taken in the course of the official business of being president. And I think that if he acts on that, and he is likely to do so, we might conceivably be facing one and then another sort of constitutional showdown with him. So I think that we can anticipate that is on the way. He's made it very clear that he's going to harness the Justice Department in favor of his policy goals, not the least of which is acting retributively toward his political opponents. Mm-hmm.
June 2022 ruling on abortion, that there was no longer a federal right to abortion. There's been a lot of ballot measures at the state level following that, and every single one of them up until this week would have guaranteed access to abortion had been improved over the 2 years. However, that track record ended Tuesday. There were 10 abortion measures that went to various state voters. People in Florida, plus then here locally for us, South Dakota and Nebraska defeated abortion rights constitutional amendments. There are also special ballot measures in those two states, such as medical marijuana in Nebraska and sales tax in South Dakota. Thoughts on the South Dakota voters and how they decided on this, or Nebraska as well, I guess?
Well, I can say in South Dakota, one of the challenges, I guess, for proponents of Amendment G, which was the abortion amendment, was just the sheer number of initiated measures, 7 of those, and several of them rather complex. In addition, of course, the amount of money historically and the interest groups and how well established the no vote, really the pro-life movement, is extremely strong. But really in South Dakota, it was a very simple, very good strategy of no on everything, or rather, as we saw West River, especially the yes on F, no on the rest. That kind of approach speaks really well to voters. This was a long ballot for South Dakotans. And I know even in my county, for example, we had 3 county commissioners, so that meant 6 candidates for that. We also have 2-member House districts, which also means that you can have 2 or 3 or 4 candidates there. And so we're talking a very long ballot, and those initiated measures were very long. Amendment G itself was a complex compromise approach, which is very common around the world, of a trimester approach, but it's a complicated issue for voters to think about. And so a very simple G is too extreme, no on everything approach, I think really is what sealed the deal for that.
On Tuesday, when I went to talk to people at the polling place, I was in North Sioux, and I literally drove up behind a guy who had a short bumper sticker, like 4 words, G is too extreme, I think is essentially what it was.
I haven't followed all of the details of the Nebraska situation, but I think it was complicated by the fact that you had 2 different initiatives that were going in clearly opposite directions, and I think it comes back to throwing voters off in terms of which direction to go with these. Mm-hmm. One was portrayed pretty heavily in the media. I mean, the Sioux City market was heavily blanketed with support for one and critique of the other, and so and again, to go to the third example a little bit further away than the Florida, we need to recognize it got 55+%, but the threshold was 60%
Good point.
passage.
Good point.
And so
Yeah.
it had a majority, but it didn't have the supermajority that was required by Florida law.
Also in South Dakota, initiated Measure 28 failed. It would have removed the state's tax on grocery items and potentially other purchasable consumables. Kristi Noem praised that. She said it was Dakotans making a wise decision to defend fiscal responsibility. Thoughts on how that was presented, how voters consume that, and how they ultimately chose?
Yeah, that one was, again, very challenging. I think a lot of these ballot measures were difficult for voters, and there are complicated matters that, are difficult both in the wording, the definitions, as well as what are the policy implications. This is one where, for example, well, what if we remove tax on groceries? How do we make up for that revenue? That is something that the legislature could have dealt with in an easier way, whereas when the voters do, it's just removing the revenue and not replacing it with another piece, leaving it at that single issue, and that's very complicated. But there were a few pieces that were very challenging. Part of that was the definition of human consumption, and opponents really latched on to that, like, well, it could be anything then. And, that's, again, something that the legislature could have dealt with, but it made it easy to market and to strategize in that way. The other part was the municipal league pushed a lot against the language that was used on the could municipalities continue to collect. Well, because the language was continue to collect, but municipalities actually don't collect taxes, they were very concerned that municipalities would not be able to continue to receive the taxes because the state actually collects and then sends that money to the cities. It's not that the municipalities themselves already collect the money. And so, again, a language concern. And so I think on that one, there really were, and there are a few other of the initiated measures, the sort of strange bedfellows kind of issue, where you had some people who maybe wanted to remove the costs on specifically groceries, but were concerned about revenue for the government to continue to provide for the same impoverished population that may have been able to take advantage of population who just simply want no more taxes and lower taxes. And so I do think that there were some who were maybe more educated voters who maybe were opposed to it due to some language issues, and some more low information voters or very much more simple no taxes kind of folks. And so I think that made it, for, again, a very, very challenging issue that maybe would have been better dealt with in the legislature. And there have been legislators previously, Ray Ring from Clay County in particular in the past, who's been trying to work on this issue. Again, you mentioned Governor Noem has previously worked on this issue, but came up with this other lower sales tax overall deal. And so I think that's why that measure failed.
Thank you, Professor Hellweg, and to all three of you. For this edition of What's the Frequency, we've been discussing the November 2024 general election results with three political science professors from Siouxland. That was Julia Hellweg of the University of South Dakota, Bradley Best of Buena Vista University, and Patrick McKinley of Morningside University. Before we finish, I want to bring back a discussion I had earlier this week with people on why they voted and what informed their vote on Tuesday. I spoke at about 6 p.m. with Woodbury County Auditor Pat Gill, who said that there were no voting glitches technologically on the day, but he added that there were a few rural precincts who were getting more ballots to finish out the day. He was not concerned about voter intimidation, so he did not add extra security at county polling places. I then went to Spalding Park School in Sioux City, where 400 people had voted at 6 p.m. with about 2 hours to go. Several people talked about their voting experience, including two who had voted for the first time. Samarian Anderson of Sioux City described voting for the first time at age 19, and he said it was a very easy process.
I know that I have 4 sisters. Personally, I'm the only boy in my family, and I'm also really close with my mom. And I know that this election was really important for women's rights, and so I wanted to make sure that I made a difference today. I kind of was a last-second decision to vote. I just registered today, actually. Yes, it was very easy.
Gina Snow of Sioux City said the economy is concerning to her.
Everyday life, prices are going up, everything's going up.
Corey Gilmore of Sioux City also talked about his motivations for voting.
Nationally, the economy, the border are definitely big issues for me. And just kind of some of the smaller things are in our community is just taxes and our economy here and locally.
Okay. And taxes, are they too high, too low? Like,
I think they're a little too high.
Etta James of Sioux City was also voting for the first time, although she is older than the other first-time voter, Anderson.
This is my first time. I am 31 because I have a daughter and I want to make sure that her rights are protected. Mostly the fertility issues, like whenever the abortion laws is a big thing for me. It was hard for me as far as deciding the candidate. I would say I was definitely tossed up on what I wanted to do, but after doing the pros and cons list, I figured out pretty quickly what I wanted to do. I just wanted to make sure that my daughter has a good future to go into.
And that will be a wrap for this edition of What's Your Frequency on the 2024 general election. Thanks for listening, and please join us again next week. What's Your Frequency airs on Fridays at 10 a.m. and again on Sundays at 2 p.m. Make sure you check out a few of our Siouxland Public Media music shows that air at 10 p.m., as we have Mixtape Dance Party on Fridays and 10 o'clock Blues on Saturdays. For Siouxland Public Media News, I'm Brett Hayworth.